Okay, dear participants, thank you so much for joining today's FRH talk. It's my pleasure to welcome today Maria Arno. She's an architect and assistant professor in the Faculty of Architecture at Warsaw University of Technology. The topic of today's talk is the patterns and paths of adapting religious heritage buildings in Poland. Maria has an extensive experience in this matter. She's recently published, actually this month, she authored a book that was published this month titled Adaptive Reuse of Roman Catholic Churches, Good Practices and Viable Solutions for Converting Sacred Spaces. In this book, she analyzed 25 case studies from Germany, Poland, Netherlands, and Belgium. So it's quite interesting to see how the transformation of these religious heritage sites are analyzed. She takes into account the historical evolution of the church reuse, also impact of secularization, ethical responsibilities of architects, and also conservation principles that should be used when addressing this sacred heritage management. So with no further ado, Maria, you can begin your presentation, and then we can maybe have a Q&A at the end. Thank you so much.
I will share my presentation with you. Good afternoon. Thank you, Jordi, for very kind introduction. I'm very pleased to be here and grateful for the opportunity to present today and to discuss patterns and path of adapting religious buildings in Poland. Please make sure if you can see the presentation. First, I will start with a brief historical overview of Poland's religious landscape over the last 300 years, highlighting key events that have shaped its religious heritage. Then I will present example of church reuse in Poland, followed by current statistics on religious denominations. Then I discuss management and funding aspects, and finally, I will outline future development prospects. Historically, Poland was a multicultural and multi-religious country. In the 16th century, when the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was created, it became known for its religious tolerance, attracting many religious groups such as Jews, Protestant, and Muslim Tatars settled in this region in connection with military service. So ethnic Poles at that time made up just about 40% of the population, with the remaining 60% were made of other ethnic and religious groups. After the partition of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth at the end of the 18th century, Poland disappeared from the map for 123 years. The country was divided between Russia, Prussia, and Austria. So under the Russian partition, under the Russian rule that occupied eastern part of the territories, Orthodoxy was used as a political tool to promote Russification. At that time, many Orthodox churches were built, forcing believers into Orthodoxy. In Prussia, that occupied western part of nowadays Poland, Protestantism dominated and the Catholic Church was seen as a threat. In Austria and Austrian rule, so Austria itself was a Catholic country, so Catholic Church was rather controlled than opposed. And in Galicia, in the southern part of the country, it became later an important part of local autonomy. After 123 years, Poland regained its independence in 1918, and nationalist trends intensified with the domination of Roman Catholic Church. At that time, only 1/3 of the population, so about 30%, belonged to national minorities, mainly Ukrainians, Jews, and Belarusians. So Poland consists of almost 70% of the population. The Polish authorities viewed Orthodox churches as a symbol of Russification from that partition period. And many churches, as I mentioned, Orthodox churches were built, and they were seen as a political tool by the popes. So we can see at numbers that after and during the interwar period, about 100 to 150 Orthodox churches were demolished, and a similar number from 150 and 200 were converted into Catholic churches, and some of them fell into ruins. A notable example is the Alexander Nevsky Cathedral in Warsaw, located in the city center, and once it was the tallest building in the city. After the independence, it was regarded as a symbol of unwanted heritage. It was demolished in 1926, and then its material was reused in new construction. The end of the Second World War marked a turning point and the start of a new period, because Poland became nationally and culturally very homogeneous countries. Due to resettlements and border changes, minorities made up less than 3% of the population. The Protestant from central and western part of the country were resettled beyond the Odra River, and they were replaced by Polish settlers relocated from the eastern borders, particularly from present-day Belarus and Ukrainian. Many Protestant churches during that time were repurposed for secular use, and many of them also were fell into ruins. So the country, the state policy favored incoming Roman Catholic population. And if we look at some statistic data on the right, you can see that, for example, before the Second World War, there were about 300 Protestant churches and 1 million believers in the region Warmia and Mazuria. It's central part of the Poland. And after the war, less than 5% of the buildings remained, 41% churches disappeared, and others were converted, repurposed for secular use, or fell into ruins. A similar situation also affected Jewish heritage. For example, these are some statistics from Podlasia voivodeship, the eastern part of Poland. 18 synagogues have been preserved to present days, and 9 were used for cultural use, and others were transformed to other secular purposes. So the post-war consequences are still visible today, because if we look at the map of number of unused religious buildings divided by voivodeship, most of them are former Protestant churches located in Western Poland. And as a result, mostly Protestant religious buildings were converted into the museums and for cultural purposes. After the Second World War, museums located in former religious buildings account for 7% of the entire state museum stock in Poland. One of the example is the reuse of church and monastery of St. Bernardine in Wrocław. Originally, the church was built in the 15th century for Roman Catholic community. Then it was handed over, transferred to Protestant church in the 16th century. It served its function until 1945. When the church and the monastery was completely damaged in 70%. After the war, conservation and restoration works were carried out. And then in 1960s, it was decided to open the Museum of Architecture in a former church and a monastery. So the nave and presbytery have been converted into an exhibition and concert hall. All sacred elements and connotation were removed or just were demolished and were destroyed during the war. The building the solid of the building has been preserved, and even now it continues to hold its place within the urban landscape. The former refectory now accommodates a cafe and a bookshop. Also, Gothic architectural details that has been preserved are showcased in western cloister and other part of the building. The upper floors of the former monastery and now have been adopted for office use for the purpose of Museum of Architecture. You can see that also chapel is used as an exhibition space. A few years ago, steel platforms have been installed in side aisles to accommodate also exhibition, and the nave and this the former church is used for cultural and different festivals, exhibitions, and events. Another example is a former church of St. John in Gdańsk. It was built also in Middle Ages. Then it was handed over to Protestant church. During the Second World War, it was damaged. After the war, it was used as the warehouse of stone architectural details during the reconstruction of the old city center of Gdańsk. And only in 1991, the building was handed over to the Archdiocese of Gdańsk, and later it was leased by the Baltic Sea Cultural Center. And only after that, the conservation and restoration works were carried out. And now a cultural center of St. John is located in this building. So the interior has been divided into sacred and secular zone. Key elements, including the main stone altar, have been preserved in the presbytery, where Holy Mass is celebrated every Sunday at noon. On the opposite side of the presbytery, the stage has been installed. The nave function as both an audience for cultural events and sittings for mass, with movable sittings that can be rotated if needed. The entire tower also has been adopted to support cultural center. It accommodates now artist dressing room, and also additional mezzanines were added on side aisles of the church interior. During the adaptation works, architects and conservators tried to keep and save the original character and spirit of the place. So stones of the church console have been preserved, and also epitaphs. The organs were restored, the baptismal chapel was rebuilt, and after underground heating had been done, the tombstones that preserved during the Second World War returned to their original place. The history of Dominican church and monastery in gallery in Elbląg is very similar to the previous one. So during the war, the monastery was completely destroyed. The church has survived, and after the war, reconstruction and conservation works were carried out. So now the epitaphs, tombstones have been preserved, and the building serves as a cultural center. Many festivals and cultural events take place there. The external form of the building also has been restored to its original Gothic form. And a few years ago, new structure of steel platforms on side aisles was added. The church liturgical furnishing haven't preserved, and organs and other movable elements were either destroyed during the war or looted in its aftermath. You can see that the presbytery, the structure of the presbytery, the wall have been preserved and is unchanged. All sacred elements were removed, and after the war, the built-in ark has been carefully reconstructed. The only preserved north cloister after the Second World War was transformed into a cafe, and I was able to observe it during my visit in 2019. And it's interesting that 6 years later, when I was there in 2025, only exhibition functions remains in this cloister, and the cafe was no longer there. It was relocated on the basement level. The preserved part of the tower is a remaining part of a Protestant neo-Gothic church of Martin Luther in Świnoujście. It was erected at the beginning of the 20th century. There were 100 seats and very modern organ there. It was damaged during the war and demolished later in 1962. And so it was decided that the tower bell was reused at the cafe in a tower, and now it's also a viewpoint of the city. And it was the tower was reused in 2009. The future of the former church and post-Cistercian monastery complex in Lubiąż, in the region of Lower Silesia, southern part of Poland, remains uncertain. This complex is the largest Cistercian abbey and the second largest religious complex in the world, featuring Europe's longest Baroque facade. Since 1989, this complex is managed by the Lubiąż Foundation, which has carried out conservation and restoration works. Some part of the complex, most representative halls, chambers, and former refectory have been open to visitors. But despite this, much of the site remains empty, including this huge former church. The complex is occasionally used for festivals, and sometimes it's even set for horror movies. But still, there is no investor capable for fully adopting and restoring this historic monument. There is one simultaneous church in Poland that I have already found. So originally built for Protestant community in 16th century, then it was rebuilt. After the war, it was registered as a historic monument, but also because of the number of parishioners significantly declined in the city, it was decided to share the church building with growing Orthodox community. So starting from 1960s, there are two legal owners of the historic buildings. Fortunately, the entrance was located centrally, and when entering, the Protestant part is from one side of the building, and on the opposite side, there is an Orthodox section and Orthodox places of worship. The end of the Second World War was a turning point not only for religious heritage preservation of non-Catholic churches that we discussed before, but also the end of the war was a start of a new period in Polish sacred architecture. And this period is sometimes regarded as a complex social, political, and special phenomenon, because between 1945, 1988, 89, over 300 churches were built, which constitute about 30% of all churches in Poland. It's calculated that there are about 10,000 church buildings in Poland. So these churches were built by parishioners using whatever materials they can find. They became not only expression of faith, but also a form of resistance to Soviet authorities. It should be mentioned that after the Second World War, Poland fell within the Soviet sphere of influence. And at that time, local communities became more active, and it was exactly the time when the Catholic Church gained a significant role in public life. And even today, in Poland, a country with very deep Christian roots, new churches continue to be built. And the design of church is very diverse, and there are many kitsch and huge sacred buildings, as we can see on this slide. For example, the Basilica in Licheń, built in a very small village in central Poland, is the largest church in Poland, the 8th largest in Europe, and the 12th largest in world in terms of religious buildings. The idea to build the church, the Temple of Divine Providence in Warsaw, as a votive offering from the Polish nation in honor of the Constitution of May, appeared at the end of the 18th century. Then, because of this project was delayed because of the partition of the country of the First and Second World War, later the communist government. So work started again only in 1989. The temple was finally built in 2016, and it's not only the place of worship, but it's also a place where many important national state events take place. And of course, these churches are not listed. There are also a huge range of iconic churches built in the second half of the 20th centuries. One of them is, for example, the church in Krakow, the so-called Lord's Ark. Not only because its roof make the building resemble to ark, and many people say that the shape, the solid of the building also refers to the chapel of Roncham designed by Le Corbusier. And it's very interesting that the bell to this church that now are hanging on the front wall were a gift from Catholics from Netherlands and Belgium, from unused churches. The churches in Warsaw, for example, presented on this slide, built of concrete and brick, are example of striking brutalist architecture and are referred as iconic churches of this period. Since I have an opportunity to present today, I couldn't miss mentioning my favorite contemporary architect of sacred architecture in Poland. It's Stanisław Niemczyk, often referred as a Polish Gaudi. He combined traditional materials with the Christian symbolism in a contemporary approach to church design. Most of his churches were built in Silesian region, its southern part of Poland. And his architecture is in opposition of these kitschy and huge church buildings that we have seen previously. For example, the Church of Holy Spirit in Tychy refers to a tent. Others see echoes of a burial mound or the coal heaps, typically for Silesian landscape. The church in his hometown of Czechowice-Dziedzice is often described as a story of the brick because this material was laid in varied patterns and create architectural details. The church in Pszczyna is still in process and is planned to be completed in 2026 because this project is based on the final design by Stanisław Niemczyk, who died in 2019. The building is designed on a basilica plan with many details and features inspired by historical styles. And now, if we look on a current situation and ethnic statistic data, you can see that according to 2021 national census, 4 respondents declared a nationality other than Polish, while the majority still identified as Poles. So maybe the situation changed a little after the outbreak of the war in 2022, but still Poland, but the statistic doesn't change much after that time. In this census, 79% of respondents answered the question on religious affiliation, and of these 72 declared themselves to be religious. 71 of these identified with the Roman Catholic Church. So you can see that Poland still is nationally and culturally a very homogeneous country. At the same time, according to the latest statistic from 2020 to 2025, Poland is undergoing one of the fastest rate of secularization in the world and the fastest rates of secularization in Europe, especially among young people. So there you can see that there is a clear decline in indicators such as dominicantes and communicantes, as well as the number of baptism and marriages, although Christian tradition remains deeply rooted in the society. And it should be also mentioned that the Poland's demographic situation, comparing to other European countries, is one of the worst, because the country is facing a deep demographic crisis characterized by negative population growth, a sharp decline in birth rates, and also rapid population aging. But on the other hand, positive hand, if we look at the report on the state of preservation of immovable monuments in Poland, that's a mistake. It's immovable monuments in Poland, prepared by the National Heritage Board in 2017. Religious buildings are the best preserved group of monuments. 25% of religious buildings are classified in group 0 and 60% in group 1. So the group of religious buildings of 85% are characterized not only by a good technical condition, but also a high degree of preservation of original historic fabric and form. And it should be mentioned that that religious buildings constitute the second largest category of listed immovable heritage after the residential buildings, and they represent almost 18% of the entire stock. It should be also noted that most churches and parish buildings in Poland are owned by the church, so by individual parishes, dioceses, or religious orders. Properties belong to other churches and religious denominations, for example, for Orthodox and Protestant community, are always owned by religious communities. Some religious buildings, particularly historic ones, may be owned by the state or municipalities, but such examples are very limited. And under the law, the Catholic Church in Poland administers its affairs and property independently, while also they can receive financial support from the state. And if we look at this table regarding grants and fundings, you can see that there is a statistic that in the years 2008, 2016, funding for religious heritage constituted more than 63% of all grants awarded by the Minister of Culture and National Heritage for immovable heritage asset. Additionally, fundings may be obtained from the church fund. So this fund applies in particular to technically maintain the historical religious buildings. And for example, in 2025, a record amount of 62 million euros, I calculated it from the Polish zloty, has been allocated to the church fund. Also, a church as an institution can apply to the national and 16 regional funds for environmental protection and water management. And of course, it can participate in EU-funded projects and financing. It also should be mentioned that the state, the country, provides support to the church and clergy. For example, the state pays salaries to clergy members and nuns employed in public institutions. The state allocates annually about 273 million euros, also calculated from the Polish zloty, annually to salaries for those teaching religion in schools. Clergy receive a remuneration for providing services in military, police, fire service, hospitals, and prisons. Churches also are exempt from corporate income tax on income used for religious, educational, scientific, cultural, and charitable purposes. And usually buildings used for religious purposes, as well as residential buildings used for of clergy and members of religion orders, generally exempt are from property tax. The contemporary, let's say, examples of church reuse in Poland are very limited. The one of them is the latest from Krakow. So the Angel Wawel residential complex was designed in a former monastery, and the former two-storied chapel was incorporated into one of the apartments. Because the complex was listed as a historic monument, of course, conservation works were carried out. But it should be mentioned that over the past 100 years, the complex fell into ruin, and only a foreign investor undertook this adaptation and redevelopment of this historic space. In the second example from Krakow is Hedwig's Bar in a Stradum house, in a Stradum hotel. Once it was a home of church and monastery. Later, that building was transformed into a military headquarters and even functioned as a hospital and communal apartment. So you can see that that's why, because of this long history and secular use of this church before its final adaptation, no religious connotation and elements have been preserved. So now there is a bar located in this Gothic chapel. An example of St. Barbara's chapel in the Silesia shopping center in Katowice is very unique and interesting on a national Polish scale, because the chapel was arranged in a former engine room, machine hall that adjacent to post-industrial complex. It was an attempt to encourage to pray while shopping. And the parish priest told me that in this case, apparently it works, because the shopping mall is surrounded by housing development, is surrounded by many apartment houses. So instead of constructing a new temple, a new church, they adopted the existing building for as a places of worship. So sometimes there are some advertisement offering churches or even cemeteries for sale, but such examples really are very limited. And for now, there are no clear signs that church reuse will become so common as such a widespread phenomenon as it's in Western Europe. There is certainly a process of secularization in Polish society, and me as a researcher, so I'm personally very curious to see how this situation will develop in Poland and in which direction this transformation will evolve. But the current situation, religious situation in Poland reminds me of what the Dutch primate, Archbishop of Utrecht, William Jacobus Eijk, described in his book, God is Alive in Holland. He argued that the secularization of the second half of 20th century in Holland is a consequence of the 1920s, 1930s situation, when being Catholic became more a matter of social belonging than personal belief. And as people were raised within their religious tradition and framework without experiencing faith as a deeper level. So in my personal view, the Poland is now in a very similar situation that the Holland was 100 years ago. And speaking about legislation, so Polish law doesn't currently provide specific regulation for the reuse of buildings that previously served religious function. This hasn't been an issue so far. However, it's likely that the need for appropriate legislation, a law, some legal frameworks and guidelines will emerge in the near future. And that's why the aim of the research I've conducted was to identify good practice and viable solution for converted sacred spaces. It seeks to analyze opportunities and constraints, challenges and consequences. And I wanted to share this insight not only with the Polish society, but also across Europe. As there are numerous examples of church reuse in Germany, Netherlands, and Belgium. And these countries were the territorial scope of the research. And I believe that these cases can support researchers, architects, conservators, and church authorities from other countries to analyze and to implement appropriate, selected for them solutions. So, as the proverb says, prevention is always better than cure. So, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Maria, for this wonderful presentation. Now maybe we can open the floor for any questions, comments. Feel free to jump in. I don't see if anyone has their hand raised, so just you can raise any questions, comments.
That was really very, very informative. I run the Royal Commission on the Ancient and Historical Monuments of Wales, and we are facing similar sorts of problems in Wales of secularization. We're going to lose perhaps 30%, perhaps more, of our churches and places of worship in the next 10 years. So I was really interested to hear what Maria had to say. And I've ordered your book, Maria. What I think our feeling is in Wales is that we don't object at all to churches and chapels being turned to other uses. What concerns us is the lack of access, because these buildings are still very much studied by art and architectural historians and social historians, and just by ordinary visitors and tourists who have an interest in the heritage. And the problem is that if they get turned into private homes, which is the fate for many in Wales and in England indeed, you can no longer have access to study them. So I wondered whether there are any parallels within Poland or within Europe as a whole for insisting that people who take on places of worship and convert them have to provide access in response to a request from somebody to visit. That's my question. Do we have examples of that?
Thank you, Christopher, for the question. So I've studied a lot of example starting from extended use, so cultural purposes, and also I analyzed the object that now are residential homes, port office as a different office, and I exactly understand what you are talking about, because I think that church buildings cannot be treated only in some financial aspects, because the value of this building is this liturgical function and this accessibility. Because they represent something that is visible or something that is invisible. And I think that people should take into consideration during the adaptation process. And after analyzing a lot of examples, I believe that this extended use to leave sacred function in some part of the building, for example, in some part of the building, chapel, in presbytery, inside chapel, or sharing it with the other Christian communities, because there are a lot of examples. Of course, it's the best solution. I know that analyze many church reuse in Netherlands. Maybe the easiest way is to sell it to private investors, but then you cannot. You do not have influence on what the church will serve. And of course, when you adapt it to residential use, so it's not a public space anymore, the morphology of the building, the structure, the narration with its original sacred function is lost. So, and the church is this value, this liturgical symbolic values, also this value is lost. So I think that's why it's very important to try to preserve this narration of its original function in some part of the building, and looked for some function, some purposes that make the building still open to the community, for, of course, for tourism, for different cultural events. I'm very fond of many examples of church reuse from North Rhine-Westphalia, when they were adopted as a columbaria, as burial place. And so they serve as the building can be a funeral building, so where funeral services take place. It's also a columbarium, and at the same time, sometimes cultural events also take place. So I think that there are a lot of good examples in Western Europe that can be analyzed and implemented in other parts of Europe and in the world.
That's very helpful, Maria. We also very strongly encourage the people the church and chapel authorities to consult the community if they're planning to close a church or chapel about future use, and to try and regard it as a community asset. And one of the most promising lines of thinking at the moment is that some of these churches should become places for accommodating pilgrims travelling along pilgrimage routes in Wales. Personally, I'd love to see a law in Europe that said that every September, every church that's been sold and converted must open to the public, because of course September is European. It's the month in which many historic properties are open around Europe. It would be good to see churches included in that as a sort of compulsory thing, not an optional thing. But that's just a dream.
Any other questions, comments? Yes, Michael Mail.
Yes. Hello, Maria. Can you hear
Hello,
me okay?
Michael.
Yes, hello. That was a terrific talk, Maria. Very informative. My organization is the Foundation for Jewish Heritage, so of course we have a specific focus on that. And I appreciate, Maria, obviously the narrative regarding Jewish historic buildings, historic synagogues is obviously a specific story in Poland. The community in effect disappeared after the Second World War through the Holocaust, etc., and hasn't really been rebuilt. It's now tiny. A number of synagogues were destroyed in the war, but many also survived the war. And I appreciate it's obviously a far smaller number and more niche in looking at places of worship across Poland. But I just wondered, Maria, whether you'd done, I thought I'd just take the opportunity just to ask you whether you'd done any particular, had you looked at the issue of synagogues? I'm just wondering whether you had picked up any insights in relation to historic synagogues in Poland that you may be able to share.
Thank you, Michael, for your question. Personally, I was not interested in a synagogue and adaptive reuse of this historic and the history of the synagogue and how they are used now. But I know many researchers, especially that came from eastern part of Poland, so from Podlasie voivodeship, from Lublin, where there were a lot of Jewish religious heritage, and they made inventarization. So they made a lot of research, even I believe digital research about unused or some Jewish synagogue that fall into ruins. So if you are interested in the context or in the publication, I know that it's very that this is the topic of some researchers in Poland that concentrate only on Jewish religious heritage in Poland, and they cooperate, I believe, with the other Jewish organization in Europe, and try to find funds, money to restore them and to open them to the public view.
Okay, right. Thank you for that.
Spieta, I see you have your hand raised.
Hello, good morning. I would like to say something, as I may, about the Polish Jewish heritage, about the synagogues. Contemporary in Poland, we have only 2,000 people who belongs to the Jewish religious community. It's a very small group. Before the Second World War, it was about 3.5 million people. And after the Second World War, now, we have only 5 open for prayer synagogues. It is an Orthodox synagogue in Kraków, Synagogue Remu, synagogue in Wrocław, Warsaw, Gdańsk, and Poznań. Some synagogues are open only for time for prayer. For example, when we have Yortzeit. Yortzeit is a festival dedicated for the tzaddik, for Hasidic minority group. As you know, the Hasidism was born in the west part of Podolia in the middle of 18th century and became the one of biggest part of Jewish tradition in the Middle Europe. And after the war, some group of Hasidics came to Poland to pray during the Yortzeit. For example, the most important place for this prayer are the town Leżajsk. Is famous for this, but not only in Poland, in the Ukraine and in Czechia, in Slovakia, in Hungary, we have some places connected with this Hasidic tzaddik history, and some Jewish people connected with the Hasidic movement make some pilgrimage each year to these places. And we have problem with the Jewish heritage connected with the cemeteries. Many of cemeteries are completely destroyed during the Second World War by the Nazi Germans, and some of these cemeteries who preserved now are under the conservation or are preserved by are treated as a national monument. For example, the Remu Cemetery in Kraków. And I think it's enough for the Jewish subject is, I think, the subject for next talk, I suppose.
Yeah, question in the chat by Augustin Hollander asking if you know any example of multifunctional uses of Roman Catholic churches that combine additional uses with also liturgical uses, and if there's a separate consecrated space for that. One of my best example, and I like the with me the most interesting example is the adaptation of church in Vught in Holland. It's a multicultural center, and because it's a multifunctional building where the museum, the library, different office,
are located, and also different cultural events took place there. There is a museum and space for local community because it's a center of a local community in the city Vught. And it's very interesting because all the functions are not divided between themselves, but they are links, so that people can go around different functions, and they are not limited. And when entering the church, on the left side there is a chapel, and because the church, the parish is the owner of this church, so it was the condition, so that the chapel for praying to be should be opened. And as far as I remember, the church of Saint Gertrude in Herle, I didn't know about if it functioned as I saw it a few years ago. Also, it's a multifunctional building. The one side nave was separated from the rest, and there is a chapel for local Catholic community. From the opposite side, the side nave was now serves as a meeting place for local government, and the main nave, it's a hall and a place for different cultural events. And it's interesting that in 2021 even the holy masses were held there because of the Christmas holidays. So there are some examples when this liturgical functions were preserved in their in the building. And of course, there are many examples of simultaneous church, so the church that is used by many, not many, but maybe 3-4 religious communities, and they have their liturgy at different days, different hours. So, and once a year, there are some ecumenical masses, ecumenical meetings of these communities.
Much, Augustus. Great. Any further question? We still have about 5 minutes, so questions, comments. Yeah, Elżbieta. Yeah.
Okay. Some comment. If we are talking about the multifunctional spaces in Roman Catholic Church, Maria, as you know, we may talk about the big sanctuaries like Licheń, Kraków, Łagiwniki, Divine Mercy, and John Paul II Sanctuary. When we have big church and other separate building connected with the church, with the functions connected with the culture or of education. For example, in the John Paul II, we have the second of the thought of John Paul, like a center of teaching or discussing about his thought. In Divine Mercy, we have some buildings apart the hotel and some center of Divine Mercy of the place when the people who are connected with this idea have some meetings. In Licheń, some places for education and small chapels for the group, a part of the big basilica, and hospitium for ill people are connected with this place. And thank you.
Thank you, Elżbieta, for your comment. Yes, it's we should take into consideration that it's a Polish cultural background, and the building of such a big churches, it was a necessity and somehow sign for our times. So people built it and they used them. Of course, there are many additional functions to the church buildings, but as I mentioned, I'm very curious how the situation will change, how adaptive reuse in which scale will occur here in Poland, because you know that I couldn't find the image of the Liheň, of the church in Liheň, remade or used for a swimming pool. And as far as I remember, it was presented at Biennale in Venice in some years ago. So there were some attempt to reuse by artists, of course, just in image, but it's difficult to say how this situation will change in future. For example, in 50 years, in 100 years, because these churches are not listed. The construction of these churches can easily be dismounted. For example, to dismount the roof, and you can divide the interior for many floors, as it was made, for example, in Rotterdam, in Bouwmankerk. So the church, the roof was dismounted, and the building was inside divided, and the box was put there, and 3 additional floors were added to the roof. So no construction technical constraints for reuse such a buildings. But of course, at this moment, it's difficult to predict if this phenomenon will be so widespread in Poland. At this moment, I believe that no, because historical buildings, as mentioned, especially religious buildings, are well preserved. They are under a conservation law, and there is no need to adopt them. Maybe the question how adopt them how make them more technically independent, because these old churches are very cold in winter, for example, and how to adopt them for contemporary use using contemporary technical materials and some insulation system, for example.
Final question, comment? No, I don't see anyone. All right. Well, thank you so much, Maria, for this wonderful presentation, sharing your insights and especially your research. It's a very key topic all across Europe, as you pointed out, and very expedient. And it's important that everybody finds solutions for this religious heritage. We recorded the session so we can share it with anybody that couldn't make it. And I wonder if you would be okay if participants contact you with questions,
yes,
ideas.
of course.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, I'm open for comments, of course, and for discussion on this topic.
Perfect. Thank you so much, and thank you all for joining today's FRH Talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much for all the participants and for the talk. We'll be in contact. So if you wish to ask me some question, of course.